Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I am Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. And at this very moment, we actually do have some breaking news that we wanted to start off with because this happened only moments ago. Really, this happened around the top of the last hour. President Trump was having a press conference. And just minutes into it, he was whisked away by the Secret Service because there was a shooting outside of the White House. And I am happy to report that the president wasn't injured. It doesn't sound like anyone was injured other than the suspect in this incident. It was the Secret Service that was involved with the shooting. They went ahead and they did it looks like what they had to do. The circumstances of the shooting are very light at this point, but I was able to find some video that does show the surveillance from the White House. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share this with everybody so that you can see what happened. And this is about the best, probably the best information you're going to have right now regarding this incident. So this is from the ABC News feed. From their YouTube, and this is looks obviously to be surveillance footage from the White House. You can kind of see the gate there. You can see the uniformed Secret Service car in the background. This appears to be the suspect. You can see him walking up. Oh, I'm sorry. This is an old video. Oh, my apologies. I'm glad I caught that before I actually show the rest of it, though. This is an old video. This is not from today's incident. I apologize about that. And that's one of the perils with the internet was that was being shared as as from this incident that happened today. So I apologize about that. I'm glad I caught it before I actually started showing the entire video. But apparently, as far as the actual facts that we know, there was a shooting. The only person that was actually shot was the president, was not harmed, and it doesn't look like anybody else was harmed other than the suspect, which we don't know his condition at this point or anything else. And I do apologize about that video earlier. I should have vetted it a little bit better, but that's some of the perils of the internet sometimes. So I apologize about that. And I'll go ahead and transition over into our daily distraction segment because I do have an article for that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So this is actually, in terms of their coverage, in terms of ESPN covering this is absolutely something they should be covering. But I just thought it was an interesting article and something that would be kind of fun to talk about because I'm a big college football fan, and this is a headline from ESPN.com that says President Donald Trump voices support for "We Want to Play" movement, and I thought this was interesting because if you look, we had a little technical difficulty there. Sorry about that. Looks like you fell out of the stream for a second there, Pete. Sorry about that. Do we have you back now? I think we might be having some technical difficulties at the moment. Pete, are you there? I'm not sure if it's on my end or if it's on Pete's end, and I apologize for that if we're having some we might be having some technical difficulties at this moment. So I apologize for that. So at this moment, I'm not sure if anybody can hear me. But this article is this is our daily distraction. Okay, it looks like the issue might be on my side. And Pete, I can see you in the private chat. If you're not able to hear me, I'm not able to hear you right now. I can't hear you at all. I apologize about this. I'm not exactly sure what the problem is at this point. My if my connection is just bad at this moment. I'm just looking it up. I'm not showing a bad connection, but it sounds like Pete, you might be able to hear me, and I just lost Pete again. So I do not know. Let's see if I can get Pete back into the stream here. Pete, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine now.
Okay. I apologize to any of our viewers or listeners about the technical issues there. I'm not sure exactly what was going on, if it was on my side or Pete's side or some combination of the two.
Right.
But as for Daily's distraction today, I just thought this was kind of a fun article from ESPN where President Donald Trump had voiced support for the "We Want to Play" movement. And what's interesting is basically he retweeted a tweet from Trevor Lawrence. And what was interesting was if you look at the actual text of Trevor Lawrence's tweet, one of the things that one of the bullet points that they offer in terms of playing college football this season is a players association. They basically advocate for a players association, which has been a very contentious issue for the NCAA. Basically, the idea of unionization of college football, and so I can't help but wonder if the president read the entire text of the tweet or not, or if he's actually endorsing the idea of a college players union. I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think so long as the universities are making money off of these players, so long as TV networks are making money off the players, so long as they're selling video games with their likenesses, I think these players are entitled to compensation, and I think it's long overdue.
That's interesting. Yeah, I actually disagree with you personally. I like the idea of college athletics remaining amateurs. The fact of the matter is that for most college athletics, the idea of endorsement deals is completely foreign. It's not something that's even on. It's not even something within the realm of possibility. It's just not there. I do see the other side of it. That I agree with you that these players provide, millions and millions of dollars, obviously, to the schools in terms of revenue. In fact, that's probably the main reason that they're talking about. This is such a contentious issue right now as far as whether they're actually going to play this season or not. There's the potential of basically hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue to all these universities with these premier football programs. But I just find it interesting because traditionally you think of conservatives as being anti-union. You think of liberals being more pro-union. The president obviously does at least market himself as a conservative. I just thought it was interesting that whether he knows it or not, he basically endorsed the idea of a college football players union, which I thought was interesting.
Right.
And
honestly, the union angle to me is the least interesting because the NFL exploits these players. I mean, not just in terms of they're getting revenue, but they have an entire farm system. Baseball has the minor leagues. The NBA has the D League. But for football, the NFL, well, you have arena football and you have Canadian football, but primarily the way that they develop young players is through our college programs, and that's paid for by taxpayers. Because even though, a lot of some of the top programs make a lot of money, for the most part, a lot of these programs are revenue negative, and they're there to draw students in because you want to go to a school where they have a good football team. I mean, that's a benefit. It's great to recruit students, but I don't think it's a terribly good use of our resources. Universities are already overpriced, and I'd rather that money go to reducing tuition and keeping the cost of education under control.
Well, I kind of disagree with you there because when you're talking about like the Power Five conferences, generally speaking, the entire the entire athletic program, the entire athletic department is paid for by the football team. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just a fact. Very few college sports of any kind are even revenue neutral. They are actually they actually lose money. And that even applies to a lot of professional sports, which is interesting too, because a lot of professional sports they actually don't make a whole lot of money. It's an interesting thing when you look into it. Professional football is the one big exception. They do make money, but in terms of actual in terms of actually supporting other athletic programs, athletic departments, things like that. For the big schools, this isn't. I'm not talking about smaller schools like Division III athletics and things like that. But for the big schools, Power Five, many of them, it's the football team that pays for the entire athletic department by far, and absolutely makes the college money. That's why they do it. They make a lot of money off of television deals, a lot of money off of merchandising, and also, of course, the boosters. You lose all the boosters if you get rid of your athletic programs because the boosters are the ones who provide the money in the first place. So I personally want to see college football happen this season. I am a big college football fan. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Right now, it doesn't look good. It looks like the Big Ten is going to pull out, and if they pull out, it's going to basically destroy the entire season. So right now, It looks like it's kind of a moot point anyway because it's not going to happen.
All right. Well, the president isn't just tweeting; he's also issuing executive orders. Could you tell us a little bit about that, Eric?
Yes, actually, I do have an article here that I thought summed things up pretty well. This is from CNET, and I was kind of curious myself because I wasn't sure exactly what these orders were doing. I just heard that the president had decided to issue some executive orders because of the breakdown in negotiations for the COVID relief in the Congress. And so this article actually does a very nice breakdown, I think, of the different orders and what they do and some of the issues. So the first one we have is for enhanced unemployment benefits, and it says with a catch. So the federal government would contribute $300 of a $400 payment, which means individual states would be responsible for the remaining $100 per person per week. And this would be starting August 1st retroactively. And basically, the issue, of course, is that a lot of governors are not going to want to foot that part of the bill. In fact, I actually saw a tweet from Governor Newsom of California that said something along the lines of the piggy bank is broken. We don't have the money. So that's the biggest issue there with that particular executive order. So again, what basically the president is doing is he's saying that the federal government will pay $300 of a $400 payment. The state has to come up with the rest. Where's the money coming from? It's coming from the disaster relief fund. Said it's about $44 billion from the disaster relief fund, and that would leave $25 billion for actual disasters. And this article also points out that the hurricane season usually costs us around $22 billion per storm. So we would be left with basically one storm left to actually have relief funds left for. So that's where that money would be coming from. And of course, the objection would be that the president doesn't have the right to do that. We do see that happen, though, from time to time, especially with emergency funds where the president will redirect them. We've also seen that happen with even the Department of Defense. That was something that the president was trying to do, where he was directing funds from the Department of Defense for the border wall, national security funds. And it becomes a question of whether he has the authority to do that or not. I would think he would have more flexibility with FEMA funds because FEMA funds are meant to be kind of flexible, but I don't know. We'll have to see where that goes. So that's one. That's one of them.
Right. Well, speaking of like creative accounting, because I see what you're saying, and I've heard this too, that the states are going to have to come up with a quarter of the funds. So a third of what the federal government is going to chip in. And I wonder because each state already has a lot of they're already doing a lot of spending on unemployment insurance. They already have a lot of spending on welfare and other things. What's to stop them from reclassifying some welfare spending that they're already kicking in as their contribution to this program. I don't see what would stop them. This is all legal, like, accounting fictions anyway. So why not just, there's got to be some way for them to get around these restrictions. It's not like their budget is going to zero. So I that's what I expect they're going
Well,
to do.
there are states that have emergency funds, though. I mean, like in Arizona, we do have an emergency fund, which could potentially be tapped for something like this. The question is whether whether the state's willing to do that or not. Like I said, in the case of Governor Newsom, I saw a tweet where he basically said he's not willing to do this. So
sure. Well, okay, but put aside the emergency funds, because that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is we're not just going to cut off all unemployment insurance here in a month or whenever this program comes into effect, and we have a lot of other welfare programs, food stamps. What is to stop us from reclassifying spending that we're already planning on engaging in order to soften the blow of this current recession, just reclassifying it as our contribution to this program. And maybe that wouldn't entitle us to get all of the funding that the federal government is offering under this executive order, but at least a significant chunk of it. So I expect the states are going to look into things like that. Again, just reclassify existing funding as a contribution to this program.
Yeah, that does make sense. It makes sense to me as well. So then another one of the executive orders has to deal with evictions. The article kind of says that this is sort of the weakest of the orders because it's essentially just a direction that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, along with the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, will basically kind of have this ability to halt residential evictions for tenants if they believe it's reasonably necessary to prevent the further spread of COVID-19 from one state or possession into any other state or possession. In other words, kind of, I guess, a interstate commerce kind of idea. So it's kind of convoluted. So the idea is that basically he's directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services, along with the CDC, to sort of identify places where if we allow these evictions with these federal mortgage programs, that's what we're talking about here. The CARES Act only applied to federal mortgage programs to begin with. That basically they would have some ability to classify certain people or certain neighborhoods. I don't know exactly how it would work, but they would basically be classifying certain areas as, hey, we can't allow the eviction because this is going to lead to a spread of COVID-19. So it would be kind of a true, administrative call by the secretaries to say, we're going to implement this in this area or for these people, that kind of a thing based on this. So it kind of punts things a little bit and puts it on them to decide who gets that, who would get that kind of protection. But again, we're only talking about federally backed mortgage programs like Fannie Mae or those who receive funds from HUD. And there would be some involvement apparently of the Treasury Secretary and of the Housing and Urban Development Secretary as well in terms of providing rental assistance. So there's also a provision in there for providing rental assistance, which is a separate issue. I know that came up here in Arizona where we had that, where you have the moratorium on evictions, but at the same time, what the state was doing was they were trying to get funds to people so they could still pay their rent. Even if they were, even though there's a moratorium on evictions, the idea is they're still trying to encourage people to pay their rent. I know they're doing that here in Arizona, and I assume they're doing the same thing on the federal level, where they are trying to make funds available for people who can't pay so they can continue to pay even with the moratorium, which is interesting. Actually, I think is a good thing. We also have one on student loan payment deferrals. Says that moratorium or memorandum on student loan deferral moves to waive student loan interest until December 31st, 2020, extending the current relief under the CARES Act, which was set to expire September 30th. So he's doing an extension of that deferral on student loan payments. He said this covers a 4-month period from September through December, and this is for people earning less than $100,000 a year or less than $4,000 every 2 weeks. So it wouldn't be universal. Folks that are making a lot of money, over $100,000 a year, or making more than $4,000 every 2 weeks pre-tax, they would not. They would still have to pay their student loans. And then we also have a sort of observation here that I think it's pretty interesting. That all these different orders are kind of going to be a moot point if a compromise is made and then Trump signs it. Because if obviously if that happens and legislation is made, then that would actually supersede any of these executive orders. And I think in large part, this is exactly very Trumpian. I've said it before. I think Trump likes to do things like this to give himself some leverage in negotiations. And I think in large part, that's why he did this, is that he's trying to use this as leverage in negotiations between the Democrats and the Republicans so they can get some sort of COVID relief package, sent through Congress.
What's the leverage, though? Why would the Democrats want to undo any of these?
Well, the Democrats have already said they don't feel that this goes anywhere near far enough. That's something I was just looking at a comment from Chuck Schumer talking about that this doesn't go anywhere near as far as they need to go to provide the relief that they want to provide. And then, of course, one of the biggest issues also is the payroll tax cut. That's another part of this, is that Trump has advocated for a payroll tax cut. And so obviously what that means is that basically you wouldn't have to pay, you wouldn't have to pay for Social Security, your Social Security tax. And the idea of this is that it would be deferred. So what would happen is you would still have to pay it later. You just wouldn't have to pay it now during the moratorium. So that's another part of this as well, is basically doing a payroll tax cut. And of course, that is a contentious issue, I think, on both sides, because there's a lot of people that think it's a great idea, and there's people that think it's a terrible idea, because let's kind of face facts here that Social Security is underfunded to begin with. So it's an interesting idea. I think in a lot of ways it's kind of the cornerstone of what he wants to do. The payroll tax is a big part of this, but we'll see what happens. Like I said, I think that this is my personal opinion. I do think that this is something that he's going to be trying to use to enable Republicans and Democrats to hammer out some sort of deal in Congress. It's not going to happen the way that it looks here.
All right. So a couple of things. Social Security is not underfunded. It's completely unfunded. We have this payroll tax, but it's a complete fantasy that you're not paying into any kind of a lockbox. This was, Al Gore's thing, that you're paying your money into a special fund and they're holding on to your money for you. And then when you retire, you're going to get that money. But it's a lie. The money's already been spent. The federal government spends $1 trillion in debt every single year. There is no lockbox. There is no money being put away. They've already spent it. I mean, this is, look, this is like if you have a relative who has a drug problem, right? And, he's already, sold your mom's wedding ring. He's living in a cardboard box, and he shows up wearing a tie that he made himself out of newspapers. And he says he has an exciting investment opportunity for you. That it's ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. The federal government doesn't have a savings program, and we know who they are. They're not doing this in secret. We can see what the problem is. They don't have the money to pay for the programs they're currently spending on.
No,
again, they were spent. What's that?
You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, they were already spending $1 trillion in debt before this crisis happened, and now we're expected to spend $10 trillion in deficit to increase the national debt by $10 trillion, so about 50% this year. It's just ridiculous, and we're about to learn what happens when you go this far to debt. I mean, if we don't experience hyperinflation after this, I don't know. Maybe we've all been wrong about what inflation is, because it doesn't seem like this can go on this way. It just doesn't make any sense. And we are seeing, the price of beef. We're seeing the price of some things go up, but we don't have evidence yet that we have really entered that hyperinflationary cycle like Venezuela and Lebanon have as of late. But one thing that this could really do from a political perspective is it could erode support for Social Security itself. Because right now, when you talk to seniors and you ask them why they support Social Security, because it's bankrupting the country, it's unsustainable, and it's not going to be there in the future, they'll tell you they paid into it. It's an earned entitlement, which, we oftentimes use that word entitlement as a bad word. But when FDR coined that phrase to describe programs like Social Security, the point is you're entitled to it because you already paid into it. Like, this is something you've earned. It's not just something you're entitled to in the pejorative sense. It's something that you're entitled to because you're a taxpayer. Now, if that fiction goes away, that we no longer have the payroll tax, then what happens politically? First of all, I don't think seniors are going to change their mind about whether or not they're entitled to Social Security. The answer is, they already paid into it. But even beyond that, if you are relying on Social Security for your retirement, for your quality of life in your older years, in your senior retired years, I don't see your support evaporating because of the accounting fiction has gone away. I think the fundamentals are still there. It's just that the lies we've told ourselves to support this program, they're going to have to change. They're not going to go away, but they're going to change.
Yeah, it's a contentious issue. I mean, Social Security is something that politicians never want to touch. They never want to really even talk about Social Security reform of any kind. So it becomes an incredibly contentious issue. It's a hot potato, but it's one of those hot potatoes that's going to explode if it's not addressed and there aren't some changes made. Because, as you said, it's not. You're right. It's not underfunded. There's nothing there. It's a bunch of IOUs. It's a big box of IOUs.
Yeah. So they're still going to send out Social Security checks no matter what, even if it does lead to hyperinflation. They'll just continue to send out the checks. So your Social Security is secure so long as you don't care about the value of the money that it's paid in.
Now, were we going to talk about the payroll taxes specifically, or?
Well, I think that's really it. That was my point about it, is that the payroll taxes are there to support Social Security, and so if we get rid of them, first of all, they are, as you said, they are being deferred. So will you have to pay them eventually? I don't think so. I don't think Congress has the guts to reinstate the payroll taxes. I don't think any congressman, and I don't care if it's an election year or not, because the voters will remember. If you have to pay double payroll taxes next year because you didn't pay them the last 6 months of this year, I don't see any congressman being willing to do anything other than forgive those payroll taxes that were deferred. So as far as leverage, that's where I think you're right. I think the president absolutely does have leverage. And I don't even know if it's leverage. I mean, he really has them over a barrel. They are going to have to do it his way because otherwise the voters will simply be furious. But this does raise an interesting question. So there are a couple other things that we haven't touched on, which is the constitutional issue. If the president can get rid of the payroll tax, could he cut income taxes in half if he wanted to? Just unilaterally with an executive order?
That's a good question. I would say, though, that there's a difference between the payroll taxes and the income tax, in that income tax, of course, is supported by a constitutional amendment, whereas Social Security is not.
Social Security isn't, but isn't the payroll tax effectively an income tax?
I suppose it could be argued that way. Certainly, I could see Chief Justice Roberts maybe advocating that, or just saying it's just another tax. So
yeah, I've always viewed it as just a portion of the income tax, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's not. You know what I mean? That's my point, I mean that's why it's referred to differently. It's not technically income tax. This is, as you said, this is a an earned entitlement, and I think that's a good way of putting it because people do pay into it. It's not like it's not as if people don't put money into the system. The problem is that the system has been grossly mismanaged by Congress,
Right.
and there's nothing there. It's a bunch of IOUs. It's a big box of IOUs. So that's the problem. That's the issue. And of course, you kind of touched on a little bit, in terms of constitutionality. My biggest problem with Social Security, ever since I could kind of conceive of the whole idea of it was, well, how can they make this mandatory? And I guess that goes into your argument that, well, they can make it mandatory because they could argue that it's income tax, and therefore you can kind of talk out of both ends of your mouth. So the payroll tax, in a sense, like you said, is the same thing, but it isn't. That's the point. It literally isn't. Social Security is something completely different than income tax. It's a completely different concept.
Mm-hmm.
This is basically people paying into a retirement fund that's administered by the government. You could even look at it as like a government pension. You really could look at it that way. That's basically what Social Security is supposed to be, but in practice, that's not what it is. That's the biggest problem. That's not actually what it is. If the government actually took those funds, set them aside, and created some sort of national pension system where that money was actually managed separately, you couldn't touch it. They couldn't use it for budgets the way that state pensions, for instance, are done. State pensions, I can tell you a lot. I can tell you, that's one thing that states, have many, and actually this has happened in other states. It hasn't happened in Arizona. But in other states, getting into that pension fund has been a big issue. And it's happened. In other states, it's happened where the state legislature has been able to break open that piggy bank and get that money, completely destroy the state pension system. And then, of course, they say, oh, well, we can't afford a state pension system anymore. We're going to transition to something else. When they were the ones who broke the piggy bank and destroyed the whole system to begin with. Well, in a state like Arizona, fortunately, the state legislature can't break into that piggy bank. They can't do it. The Arizona state constitution couldn't be touched, and they would be administered completely differently. But we don't, And then, of course, like I said, the other issue I have is that it's mandatory. I don't believe you should be able to force people into that system if they don't want to be in it. That's one of my biggest issues with Social Security. Not the fact that it exists, just the way that it exists. There's some problems there. But I don't know. It doesn't. I mentioned it before. Social Security reform is something that nobody seems to want to touch. That nobody wants to do anything about. But you do bring that up an interesting point about if the payroll tax is essentially the income tax, could the president just defer income tax? I don't know. Possibly.
And he already did it this year, right? He changed the date of when your taxes were due from April 15th to July 15th. Now, that didn't affect state.
I thought that was part of CARES. I thought that was passed by Congress.
Oh, yeah, that could be. Yeah, so you're okay. So you're right.
That was part of CARES.
There's a difference between unilateral presidential action and action where that's taken by Congress.
Yeah, Congress can stop income tax tomorrow if they wanted to.
Sure.
Congress could just say no more income tax.
Mm-hmm.
Congress could do that tomorrow if they wanted to,
Right. Now, if you remember, of course you do, the whole DACA thing where it was deferred action against children who had been brought here illegally by their parents. And the logic was essentially, well, we're just not enforcing the law. We don't have to enforce every law. We have to make decisions about which laws we enforce and which ones we don't. And so does the president have the authority to say, well, I'm just not enforcing the payroll tax law?
Well, that's an interesting idea. Of course, that's not what DACA was, because DACA was different in terms of what DACA did was it actually provided an administrative path that essentially gave you a legal status that didn't exist. That status doesn't exist under federal law. It's basically something that was created by the Obama administration. That's why so many people like myself hate DACA and think it's whether we think it's a good idea in practice. Constitutionally, it's a terrible thing that he did. It's a terrible thing that he did because he basically created a structure of legality that was completely contrary to the law. And and that's a problem I have is some people will argue the merits of whether, should we be helping these people or not? I'm not even trying to have that argument. I'm trying to say the process is what was wrong. Because it's not, because if you allow a process like that for something that you think is good, it can be used for something you don't think is good. It can be used for something that you think is really bad, So
absolutely.
That was my biggest issue with it. When it comes to the basic concept of enforcement, I think absolutely, the executive branch can decide, hey, we're not going to really emphasize this right now. Whether it's due to budget, whether it's due to a lack of resources or whatever the situation is, they can say, hey, we're just going to divert these resources to something else right now. But when it comes to income tax, where would you redivert those resources? But I mean, basically, it's not like the president has the power to abolish the IRS. They're still there. So what are they going to do?
I don't know. Harry Brown, the libertarian, when he ran for president, says he was going to furlough all the IRS agents, just put them on permanent vacation, and that way they couldn't enforce the income tax.
That's an interesting idea. I don't know how that really works because, again, I mean, these are federal employees, and this is something that has been designated. Congress has designated these funds for this purpose. I don't think that the president necessarily has the authority. That's like saying, can the president send a certain because you're talking about a furlough, right? So that's kind of like saying, like, if the president could just send the Border Patrol home and just tell them not to do their job and just go home and not do what they do. And it's like, I don't think he can, you know what I mean? Because basically we have laws that say that, no, this is their job. This is what they're supposed to do. There's money allocated for it already. He can't just take that away because he doesn't have the power of the purse, and those laws have been passed. It gets, stuff like that. I think you're kind of crossing the line, so you kind of, it goes a little too far.
I think, but I think if it actually did go to the Supreme Court, it would be very hard for them to draw exactly where that line exists, because there are all kinds of ways for the federal government to just drag its heels and under-enforce or not enforce laws passed by Congress.
Yeah, but the other side of it is that you have so many laws at this point. There are so many regulations and so many laws. It gets really tricky about what it is that you actually can and you can't do. Think of it this way. For instance, there's the famous story of when Richard Nixon started firing everybody to get to the person he wanted to fire. Well, why did he do that? Because he couldn't fire the person. Basically under the law, he couldn't fire the investigator. He couldn't fire the inspector. He couldn't fire him because under the law, he wasn't accountable directly to the president. The person directly responsible to the president was the attorney general. So he just started firing people until he could get to that person. I say, why did he do that? He did that because that's the only thing he could do. He couldn't fire the person he wanted to fire. He couldn't fire the IG because he doesn't have that authority. He can fire, but he could fire his boss's boss's boss. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of stuff that gets tricky because there are just, like I said, there's a process there of the way that the laws are passed. Where the president even doesn't have that sort of direct. In other words, he doesn't have the direct authority to go up to, say, an IRS agent and tell him what to do. He just doesn't. He can go to the head of the Treasury Department and sort of trickles down, but he can't just go in and fire an IRS agent, for instance. You can't just go in and do that.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the other executive orders had to do with evictions, and we all know why that's. Yeah, we know why that's in the news. South Carolina, I guess, is the first state that has resumed evictions, and I don't know if this is the right thing to do because you still have a lot of people who are out of work who are going to go back to work when coronavirus ends. But on the other hand, you have a lot of people who own apartment complexes. They're not getting paid. Are they getting bailed out? There's a real it's a real difficult situation that the government is in, and I don't know that there is a perfect solution because it doesn't seem to make sense that you can't evict people who are just refusing to pay their rent. But on the other hand, we've tried to put the economy into a coma with the idea that things are going to open back up again, and here it's been really since March, right? That this has been going on, and this is now the beginning of August, and so that's 5 months, and the question is, how long do you put these moratoriums in place? Because as far as I can tell, Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders have won the election so far. They've won the COVID-19 crisis, because we have right now universal income, UBI, that Andrew Yang was advocating for. He called it the freedom dividend, where we're sending everybody $1,200, and now we're about to probably pass another round of stimulus, where everybody's going to get another check. And how long is that going to go on? And I don't know. But I mean, this is kind of socialism because a lot of businesses have gone out of business. There have been a lot of bankruptcies, but we're also holding a lot of businesses, in place with these bailouts, where through PPP and other programs, we're paying for the wages of their workers. It's a real strange thing where nothing is real in the economy right now. We're just trying to wait it out, and we're spending in deficit to sort of keep things from just tanking. And I don't know how much longer we can do that until we do start to see inflation. This doesn't seem like a really good plan but as soon as this stops, we are going to see rents are probably going to have to go down because you have a lot of people who are unemployed. And so the amount that they can, if you go from, say, being a 2-income household to being a 1-income household, presumably you'll be able to pay a lot less in rent. And especially if you go from being a 1-income to a 0-income household, you're going to be able to pay a lot less in rent. So the real estate market does need to adjust to the new reality because not all the jobs are going to come back, but we don't know what percentage are going to come back. I mean, so far about 40% of the jobs that have been lost appear to have come back, although, I think that's a little bit inflated because you have some people who are, they're being paid essentially to do nothing, but the idea is their business is just shut temporarily, so they will come back. But let's say 40% is right. Okay, what about the other 60% of these jobs, the other, 20 million or so jobs that have been lost, or let's say 15 million jobs that have been lost? What on earth are we going to do to prevent the value of homes, the value of these apartment complexes from just cratering? Because I don't see that happening. During the dot-com boom, the Federal Reserve made the conscious decision to prop up the housing market. This was talked about across the political spectrum. Paul Krugman in the New York Times talked about propping up the housing market back in 2000 when the dot-com bubble burst. So, and during 2008, when the housing crisis happened, that was the seeds were sown during the 2000 crisis, and now we've done the same thing again, and we've talked about on the show how we've been cruising for another correction in the housing market. It has to happen. The price of houses is just out of control. People couldn't afford them before the crisis, and they certainly can't afford them after the crisis. But we're putting so much pressure to keep those prices propped up. I mean, what happens? I think what has happened so far is that people have just paid a greater and greater portion of their income for their mortgage, for their rent, but they're getting roughly the same amount of value. And so it's a wealth transfer is what's happening. We're transferring wealth from the middle class to the investor, to Wall Street, the investor class. So I don't know. This whole thing seems like it is going to end very badly, but I don't know that we have any other options. Certainly no better options.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking, I was looking at an article talking about one of the reasons that South Carolina is a real indicator of how this is going to play out is because their eviction laws are so they're so loose. Apparently, you only have to give someone a 5-day notice and pay a $50 fee, which is crazy to me. So basically, you give them a 5-day notice. You do some sort of $50 fee, I assume at a court or whatever, and then you can evict somebody. And that's just crazy. That's absolutely crazy to me. So literally within, the idea is that within 5 days of the moratorium going away, you could have massive numbers of evictions and massive numbers of people put on the streets. Will that happen? I don't know. I mean, there's another side to this, which is, the private sector can also look at this and say, what are we going to do? Because first of all, they've got to know it's not like they take this person out and there's going to be all these other people, waiting in line to come in. That's not there.
Yeah, right. The demand isn't there.
Yeah. The demand is, exactly. The demand is not there. It's not like you've got this long line of people with good jobs that can now move into this place. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're talking about like, low income housing and things like that, it's not like you're going to have this long line of people that are just ready to go and walk into these places. These communities are going to be devastated, by the situation. So, yeah. I think that it's the private sector has to look at this as well. They have to be realistic and say, okay, obviously we're not going to get the kind of revenue that we're used to. So they should be looking at things like, the price of their rent and things like that, that basically they are dealing with the COVID economy, and something is better than nothing, So, that's another part of it as well, so it's like, I realize a lot of these larger companies, they can sit on properties for years and years and years and just wait. But that's not the situation for a lot of low cost housing. A lot of low cost housing, your landlord. It's some guy or some girl. You know what I mean? They knew who this person is. So people kind of have to start making these decisions, and that's part of the. I think that's part of the equation as well. Is that the private sector kind of has to stand up and say, "Hey, well, what can we do?" Because sitting there with an empty house, or an empty room, that kind of a thing, you're not making any money off of that. Whereas you might have been making, whatever you were making before. The private sector has to look at this and say, "Hey, we're probably going to have to charge less." I mean, that's just the bottom line. That's what we're going to have to do. Otherwise, we're not going to get any income at all.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is what's happened for decades, which is that every city council, how does the city council, if you're running for city council, how do you raise money? Well, you go to the real estate market, to realtors, and the most important board in any city is the planning and zoning board. And what do? Well, they try to prop up the local real estate market. They try to restrict the amount of housing to keep the supply constricted, so that way the price of housing continuously goes up artificially. Whereas if you had a free market, people would build more houses, and you'd have more affordable housing, and the market would adjust. But right now we're seeing that they're still talking in Phoenix about how the market is red hot because there's not enough supply. How could there not be enough supply? Over 20 million people have been thrown out of work. It doesn't make any sense unless you realize that this is what every government at every level in the United States has been working towards. At the state level, half the state legislators are people who work in real estate or made their money in real estate, and so they're not going to allow their wealth to be diminished by a housing crash. They're going to do whatever they have to do in order to make sure that these evictions don't happen, so that way, because look, if you are buying and selling houses, you're not in the rental market. The rental sector, as we saw a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the GDP figures, has already taken a bit of a hit in the first quarter, and probably a bigger hit in the second quarter. But if you are buying and selling houses and you're not invested in the rental space, then you can stick it to them, prevent them from evicting, and that keeps the supply constricted. And eventually, when people do get evicted, what are you going to do? Well, at the federal level, you're going to bail out the banks, so that way they will accept short sales from individual homeowners, and then they will hold those houses off the market until they can get the market to recover, and then basically population increase over time will cause that to constrict a little bit more. And this is what we've been doing for decades, and it's crooked, and it's robbing American workers of their salaries, but this is what we've been doing. Yeah. So look, I see what you're saying, that if we had a free market, it would make sense that the price of houses and the price of rental properties would go down. Right now, the price of rentals does seem to be going down a bit, but boy, there are an awful lot of people who are interested and powerful people who have the levers of government at their disposal, who are very invested in preventing the real estate market from correcting. And what has happened over the past 10 years, so over 12 years really, since 2008, when the crash happened, was they have more homeowners have equity in their houses. People aren't underwater anymore. And so there's been a transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street. So that way, there's less risk if you're on Wall Street, if you're a bank, there's less risk because these people aren't just going to walk away from their homes the way they did in 2008 because they have equity now. It's going to get harder for them to make their mortgage payments. But until they go underwater, boy, they don't want to give that up. They've worked hard for that equity. That's their nest egg for a lot of people. So that's the biggest investment most people make. And so yeah, even the American voters were all kind of compromised by this pyramid scheme. And I don't know that it can go on forever, but could it go on for another 10 years? Could it go on for another 20 years? I mean, it's kind of like Social Security. This is a Ponzi scheme, and this is what the U.S. economy is. So.
Yeah, it's interesting though, but how much of an effect does COVID have on that? I mean, when you're talking about sort of the status quo, we don't have the status quo right now. So I can't help but think that there's got to be some people realizing that they have to do something, So yeah. I don't know. Again, it might be just they're going to try to use their connections in Washington to get another moratorium or something like that, and see if they can kick the can a little bit farther. But how is that a permanent solution? Eventually, the chickens will come home to roost. So,
right, yeah, but yes, you're right. What COVID has done is it has moved us closer to a day of reckoning where we're going to have to deal with the decades of bad policymaking that have made housing less and less affordable for regular people. Well, speaking of chickens coming home to roost, I don't know about you, but I've really felt over the past year very discouraged about politics in general. And this started 4 years ago when Trump came onto the political scene, that we started to see him mainstreaming conspiracy theories in a way that presidential candidates had previously really been loath to do. And if you recall so this, by the way, is that we're getting into the Save the Children thing, which is a Trojan horse for the QAnon movement. If you haven't heard of QAnon, it's we've heard about it because as we were building up our Twitter following over the past couple months, we could not get rid of these QAnon nut jobs that are, frankly following our account. And, they are dangerous, unhinged people, and they represent a very sick part of our society. They are people who believe in how to even sum it up. Essentially, they believe that they are secret agents or digital soldiers, as they call it, protecting the Donald Trump Make America Great Again movement. And they are deeply deluded people. They are often very sad people. This is a lot like any cult or any pyramid scheme that this was cooked up on a website called 8kun, which is like, 4chan. It's a message board. And it that the people, everything I've read leads me to believe, and I don't have time to kind of get into how I know this. You can read. The Federalist has a take on it. You know that I'm not a big fan of everything the Federalist puts out there, but I thought that their articles that they've put out on QAnon, including one this month, a couple days ago, I think it was August 6th, that I don't see it up here, so I can't bring it up, but yeah, it was August 6th where they were going into QAnon. These are sad people, and they are using this worship of the president, this cult of personality, as a substitute for religion. And how many people believe in QAnon? The so-called Q drops, these secret messages that are released on 8kun and other websites on Twitter and what have you. I don't know. I've heard estimates as high as like 15% of Americans are invested in this conspiracy theory. On the other hand, I've also seen polls that indicate that 75% of Americans don't even know that this exists. And so it's one of these things that it's very much kind of an underground thing, and yet it is having this very visible impact on national politics. And that's what Save the Children is. It's a Trojan horse for the QAnon movement to get itself into the mainstream. So let's sort of go back to the beginning here. Back when Trump was running for office, we all know that he pushed the birther myth, that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. And he pushed that up until the point when it no longer became tenable, when the documents were released. And then he said that he had more information. He was going to release documents at a press conference, and turned out it was all a hoax. It was all a sham. And he wanted to talk about, he was going to give some money to a veterans charity or some baloney like that. I'm not saying that giving money to veterans is baloney, but it was something it was very different than what he had claimed the press conference was going to be about. It was all a publicity stunt. So the publicity stunt was the baloney. So he has used President Trump has used conspiracy theories in order to move himself up in the polls when he was running for president, to get more notoriety. And then he just abandoned these theories when they no longer were useful to him, just like he abandons business deals when they're no longer working for him, and he just declares bankruptcy. How he uses everybody apparently around him. This is how he operates. This is the core of who he is as a person. And so, we have seen some real things going on in the country. So like the Jeffrey Epstein thing has revealed their, corruption. I mean, President Bill Clinton was knee deep in the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. Just in the past, the past week, that Mike Cernovich, the lawyer, was able to get a hold of the flight logs of Jeffrey Epstein's airplane going to and from his island in the Virgin Islands. And that's about 75 pages, 73 pages actually, of flight logs. If you listen to the QAnon people, it's about 2,000 pages, and everybody's on the logs. Okay, but this is a real thing, right? And this is real exploitation, and this is a real issue that unfortunately is becoming the subject of all kinds of crazy theorizing. That there are thousands of pages of flight logs, not just the 75 that we see, and that everybody from Bill Clinton, who really is involved, to Tom Hanks is involved. I have seen a number of prominent Republicans in Arizona this week, people who've run for office, people who have been elected to office, promoting insane conspiracy theories, suggesting that Tom Hanks by the way, have you heard of this, Eric, that Tom Hanks recently got Greek citizenship?
Yeah, he did recently get honorary Greek citizenship.
Was it honorary? I didn't know that. Okay. I thought he was really getting a Greek passport because his wife is a Greek American and she's very proud, Greek Orthodox.
He did a Greek passport. Yeah, I read an article about that. Mainstream.
Okay. Yeah, so she's Greek Orthodox. He converted for her. This is a very important part of her identity because it's tied into not just her ethnicity, but also her religion. And this is a big part of who she is. Rita Wilson is a very proud Greek American. And, if she were Baptist or, Jewish or whatever, maybe wouldn't it be as big a part of her identity, but because she's Greek Orthodox, this is very central to, how she identifies. And so he converted for her, and he got a Greek passport, as basically a gesture of, we're in this together kind of thing. And what has been circulated on Facebook, again, by a number of prominent Republicans in Arizona and elsewhere, has been that he did this because Greece is a non-extradition country. Now, Greece is not a non-extradition country. Greece has had an extradition treaty with the United States since 1932. Obviously, Greece is it's not the biggest country in the world, but this isn't the island nation of Vanuatu. This isn't North Korea. Yeah, they're officially Greek citizens. Good for them. Not a big deal. But again, this has become fodder for conspiracy theorists. That he owns sex slaves, that he is abusing children, and it's all nonsense. He was never on Epstein's Island, as far as anybody has. There are no witnesses making this claim. This is just pure insanity. But this is what QAnon is spreading, and then it bubbles up to the mainstream. So they're on the fringes, and then these stories are working their way into the center of American politics, and that's where this gets to the Save the Children thing. If you remember back in 2016, the Democrats were really desperate because Trump had won, and the Republicans had won a big victory. Hillary had lost. The Democrats thought they'd had the election in the bag, and so their question was, how are we going to organize in order to kick the Republicans out of office in 2018 and 2020? That's what political parties do. But, of course, the way they went about it was very bad faith, which was they started with, we're going to have the Women's March. Well, why the Women's March? Well, because, President Trump has a history of abusing women, which he does. He's been accused dozens of times, paid out numerous settlements, and has confessed on tape to committing sexual assault against women. The bus tapes. He confessed to assaulting women.
What are you talking about there?
When President Trump said he likes to grope women's genitals, that he was bragging about committing sexual assault. Now, I guess we could say that we don't know that he did that, but the fact is that his what he said on those tapes matches very closely. If you go back and read the accusations against him that have been made in court, they match pretty closely. So I don't think there's really any question whether or not he really did it. I don't think he would make up a story like that, having already gone through criminal proceedings where he, had been accused of things like that. So I think there's a lot.
That's an allegation. That's not a fact, Pete. Come on, you can't say stuff like that.
Yes, I can, because he confessed to it.
You can't say stuff like that for legal reasons. That's an allegation.
He said that he did it. He said that he did it.
It's still an allegation. You can't say stuff like that because
he alleged it against himself.
I can tell you right. I could say right now that I killed someone, Pete. That doesn't mean that you can call me a killer. That doesn't work that way. I'm saying that just for purposes of the show, you can't say that. That's just,
I know. Yeah, it's a hypothetical.
It's an allegation, Pete. It's an allegation. That's all it is. And you can say where you're getting the information from. I've heard the tape that you're talking about now. I just didn't know what it was called. But it's an allegation. It is not a fact. You may think
an allegation that he has confessed.
But it's an allegation. It is not a fact that Donald Trump sexually assaulted women. I'm sorry. That is not a fact. That is an allegation. He has
an allegation that he has
in any court of law that he had done that, and I need to make that 100% crystal clear that is an allegation. He has
an allegation that he himself confesses. He has
never been convicted. He has never been convicted in any court of that crime.
Right.
Period. So
yes, he hasn't been convicted. He simply admitted that he has done it. All right. So this is. So we understand why the Women's March was what it was, but that really fizzled out after 2016, pretty quickly. You haven't heard of the Women's March much since then. They've had their own scandals where people have stepped down over allegations of anti-Semitism and things like that. The Day Without an Immigrant, we've talked about that on the show before. That fizzled out. In fact, I don't think anybody even remembers that, but that was supposed to be this big thing where they were going to own the president by showing that immigrants are really important to America. And I'm not saying they're not, but the protests themselves were poorly planned, poorly executed, and didn't lead to any kind of a movement. We haven't heard about a day without an immigrant since 2016, which I think is all the evidence you need to say that the movement has been a failure. And then starting in 2017, 2018, we saw something else, which was Red for Ed. If you remember, the teachers were demanding higher pay, which is something that a lot of suburban voters are more sympathetic to. Suburban voters, they like um, teachers being paid more because they want better schools. And nobody's against teachers. It's really hard to turn voters against the teachers. And so the Democrats realized with Red for Ed that they had something of a winner on their hands. And they rode that to a lot of victories in local and state races in 2018, and even congressional races. There was a lot of Democrats elected in 2018, and so Red for Ed wasn't so much about education. I mean, I'm not saying that Democrats don't care at all about education. I mean, it is a political issue. I think people on both sides care about education, even if they disagree on what should be done about it. But they found that this was a horse they could ride, and this was going to be their vehicle for organizing their supporters. And so what I see with Save the Children is QAnon is viewing this issue of the sexual exploitation of children as a horse they can ride through 2020. They are planning to exploit these crimes as a way to, again, everybody supports teachers. Everybody is against the exploitation of children, basically. I mean, both major parties oppose the exploitation of children. It's not like the Democrats secretly have a plank in their platform that they are in favor of exploiting children or, trafficking children. That's ridiculous. So this is what they call in political science a valence issue. It's who has more passion about it. Who do the voters trust more in this issue? But this is very, very cynical because of things like the Tom Hanks nonsense, where Tom Hanks was falsely accused of assaulting children, even though there is zero evidence to support that. If you've seen the Wayfair allegations that allegedly, because Wayfair had some prices on their sites. So if Wayfair is an online furniture sales website, right? You go onto Wayfair, you can buy beds and chairs, and you can buy in bulk. And so some of the prices were really high because they were bulk prices, not like the price of an individual bed or an individual chair, or even a set of chairs. You would buy, like, if you were going to buy beds for an entire hotel or something, right? That's a lot of money. And so people looked at it and said, oh, that's outrageous. Well, maybe there are secret codes if you look at the numbers in the prices that they're charging on wayfair.com. And I saw this over and over again on Twitter, on Facebook, again, from people who are, their elected officials within the Republican Party are passing this nonsense on. And I think it's very, very cynical. And this, so with the Pizzagate thing, where allegedly there was a satanic child abuse ring in the basement of Comet Pizza, there was no basement of the pizza parlor. They tried to make the Wayfair thing an issue. That's not really catching on. Tom Hanks, nobody's going to turn on Tom Hanks. And so they've gone through this over and over again, trying to gain traction with this, and it hasn't worked. And this isn't the only type of stunt that they've tried this year to get traction. Trump's tried to make people believe at the beginning of the year that the coronavirus is essentially a hoax, that you shouldn't wear masks, that the Democrats are just trying to scare you to crash the economy. And I'm not saying that there's nobody on the Democratic side who's hoping that things go badly so that the way Trump loses. I mean, obviously there's some of that. There's a lot of that. But this Trump, I think, really made it easy for them because he made this fundamentally bad bet earlier in the year that coronavirus was not going to be as bad as the experts thought. And so he would look really smart by downplaying it. And of course, that hasn't really worked out. That hasn't worked out for him. And then the Confederate statue thing hasn't worked out at all. And so, he has gone through issue after issue, and he's continued to fail to gain any traction in the polls. He's pulled a little further, a little closer with the Portland thing, I think. I think a lot of people were really scared by what happened in Portland the past couple of weeks. But open the schools has been the latest thing. That hasn't really worked because people are worried. What's the real plan? You can't just say open the schools and not have a plan. and the president doesn't seem to have a plan. This isn't really working for him. A lot of the mothers that he thought were going to be on his side haven't gotten on his side, and so this Save the Children thing. Look, the numbers I have seen, again, posted by a candidate for Congress today, a Republican candidate for Congress, a former Arizona state senator, a former somebody who serves in the I wouldn't even say he's in the Gilbert town government in Arizona. These people, if you believe the numbers, then that your child is 60,000 times more likely to die of to be trafficked than to die of coronavirus. That would mean that 10% of children are trafficked every year, which is insane. It's outrageous. We know that's not true. 1 in 10 children are simply not trafficked every year. That's ridiculous. I mean, maybe you have some numbers to the contrary, but I cannot imagine that there are 3 to 5 million children being sold every year in the United States. I mean, just think of what that would mean if you have a high school of 1,000 or a school of 1,000 children, that 100 of them are victims of trafficking. It boggles the mind. It doesn't make any sense. And yet you are seeing these numbers. You're seeing this propaganda. It's very hyperbolic. And it doesn't it's a serious issue if it's 1,000 children. It's a serious issue if it's 10,000 or 100,000 children. Okay. I'm just saying the numbers are not adding up. And the fact that people are lying and just so out of control over this, they're saying that 800,000 children are abducted every year. No, most of those are custody disputes. I mean, those are bad, but it's not the same thing as a child being abducted, on their way to school. Someone in a white van picks them up. That would be a lot more terrifying. If you know that the mother, you're the father, you're supposed to have your child that week, and the mother picks him up illegally. That's bad, but you probably have a pretty good idea of where to find his mom. The police are going to deal with the situation sooner rather than later, hopefully, But if your child is abducted by a stranger, that's a completely different class of problem. And that's what I'm getting at. The Save the Children movement is mixing apples and oranges. They're confusing, they are conflating things like abduction by strangers with, child custody disputes, which is obscene. Because those are not the same thing at all, and they're conflating, and they're simply making up the numbers on child trafficking. Now, again, child trafficking is a very serious issue, and I could talk. I spoke with a politician today who has exposed a number of child abusers herself, and I have a lot of respect for her, and I'm glad that she's doing what she's doing, and and I trust that she knows what she's talking about. Okay. But if you're going to make a real difference, if you're actually going to expose wrongdoing, you have to know what you're talking about. You have to do your homework. And this movement, this QAnon movement that's pushing Save the Children, like I say, it's as a Trojan horse. It's a way to introduce the Pizzagate baloney, the Wayfair baloney, the Tom Hanks baloney into the mainstream through the back door, so people will be less critical of it. It is obscene, and frankly, I don't know if they buy their own baloney, because if they really believed this, if they really believed that this conspiracy was nearly as widespread as they say it is, that this wrongdoing is nearly as common as they say it is, why haven't we seen more violence? Why haven't we seen more people actually, really taking action beyond marching in the streets? Because that would mean essentially, what even would that mean? I mean, Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's just a different, it's a different kind of crowd. I don't think that's not really their gig. I mean, I've dealt with people like that for a long time, people that are on the fringes of that kind of politics and things like that. And, they live on the fringe. They don't necessarily get involved in that way. That's not all of them. I mean, they still have rallies. They just
In what way?
they've been having rallies over the Save the Children thing. As we speak, I was just looking it up on online, and I've got numerous reports from different news agencies. One in Savannah, Georgia. There's another one over in Oregon, Prineville, Oregon, which I don't even know where that is, but I know where Oregon is. Another article, again, from Savannah, Georgia, on another news outlet talking about these different rallies that they've had for Save the Children. I was telling you off the air, I wasn't even really aware of this issue until you actually brought it up as a as a topic for today. But I think that the types of people that generally believe this stuff kind of tend to exist on the fringe. That's my point. So that's why you don't see them, getting uh, more worked up, if you will, because it's their nature. It's their nature to kind of hide in the shadows and not get involved. Other than these, that what happens, of course, is you have a jump because you have the people that start these kinds of rumors and start these kind of things, and you have people that start to believe them, and generally the people that start to believe them at any one time, they get to a point where you actually start to see people. These are normal people. These are normal people that just don't understand what's going on, and for lack of information, they start to believe these things. I think that's exactly what happens when you have a lack of information. You tend to believe these things. When it comes to human trafficking and sexual exploitation, it is by its nature secretive, and criminal. So how big is the problem? Nobody really knows. Nobody knows. By its nature, you could never know. It's impossible to know. We don't take statistics on that. It's not something that they when they do the census taker doesn't ask you, are you sexually exploiting children? It's not, and of course, if they did, no one would answer. People would not be answering it
right
accurately anyway. So it's one of those things that when you have a lack of information, that's where the conspiracy theories start to happen, and because there's a lack of information here. By its very nature, it's seedy, it's criminal, it's something that a lot of people don't really know exactly what's going on. That's absolutely true. That's even true in law enforcement. A lot of people don't understand exactly what's going on. So even people that should or you think would, they don't know what's going on. So there's all this room where you can make whatever claim you want because it's impossible to independently verify.
Right. But at some point it does, beg your belief. Like if you said that the percentage was 90% of children, people would say, no, that's not right. If you said it was 50% of children, no, it's not 50% of children every year. 10% of children, still probably not. It just doesn't. I would have to. I mean, maybe I'm off base here, but I would think if it were 10% of children that you would not be able to talk to parents anywhere without this being the top thing that everybody is talking about all the time. I mean, if it were 10% of children, I mean, my God, you would never let your children out of your sight, because every school would be afflicted by this. It would be front page news everywhere all the time. I mean, am I wrong?
Well, I think also you have to realize you live in the United States, and this is actually a global problem, a global issue. One statistic I was looking at says that anywhere between 25 and 40 million people are estimated to be in some sort of sexual slavery per day. Per day. Of course, that's globally, that's worldwide. But in other countries, these kind of problems are much worse than they are here.
Right.
So it's not like there's no problem and this doesn't exist. Of course it exists. It exists on a massive scale, a much more massive scale than I think you or I are aware of, because we live in an isolated bubble called the United States of America.
Sure. But we're right. But that's exactly it. We're talking about the United States. These numbers that are being put out, that your child is 60,000 times more likely to be abducted and sold in as a sex slave than they are to die of COVID. That they're talking about the United States. They're not talking about worldwide. I mean, I have no idea what's happening in the third world, if this is just rampant in the third world. But I can tell you, in the first world, it is not 10% of all children. I don't know. So yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is I do worry about how these rumors are so widespread. And if you could throw up, here's an article by about one of these QAnon people, that this guy believed he was assassinating a mob boss, and his lawyer says that he was under a QAnon delusion. You can see him there holding up the Q that was written on his hand. He's not alone. He's not the only person in the past few years who has bought into this. And you're saying they're on the fringe and they're making a jump. My concern is that we are reaching a point where either we're going to find that the people who are promoting this myth are liars. They are intentionally deceiving and spreading propaganda. Many of them, not all of them, of course. Or they believe this. And if they believe this, then what's to stop them from killing innocent people? What's to stop them from, setting Tom Hanks's house on fire? All the innocent people who have been accused. What's to stop them from being targets of, violence by the QAnon mob? And if it, on one hand, it's good if this doesn't happen, if this doesn't come to fruition. But what does it say about our country that we have this nonsense being pumped through the pipes of our social media constantly? If nobody believes it, everybody is sharing it and they're talking about it. I mean, not with everybody. There are certain circles you can travel in that you won't hear this stuff. But this seems to be mainstream in the Arizona Republican Party right now, and I just don't know what to do. What is our politics about anymore if this is the level of discourse that we are sharing conspiracy theories to one another, and facts no longer matter because everything is fake news. That meme was started to discredit the media, so that way, anytime bad news came out, you wouldn't believe it, and all you believe is the set of lies that you're receiving from your friends on social media. It's cynical post-truth politics, and we've seen a lot of unrest, and we've certainly seen like Portland and Minneapolis lit on fire over the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd stuff. And you've mentioned the coronavirus thing has made people more agitated because they're stuck in their homes and they can't work, and people are frustrated. People were frustrated in 2016. That's why they elected Donald Trump. They were sick of Washington apparently doing nothing about a lot of these real issues about the opioid crisis and unemployment and the suicide crisis and jobs going to China and stagnant wages and what's been done about any of that? As far as I can tell, really not very much. And so people are still frustrated, and now they're stuck inside. You have coronavirus. You have 200,000 Americans dead. If you look at the CDC figures of the excess deaths over last year, This is a very sad year for our country in so many ways. If we're unable to have real conversations about politics because we're having massive demonstrations to protest against, a crisis that is, I mean, not just overblown, but we have no reliable figures on. And, like I said, look, if 1,000 children every year were victims of this kind of violence, that would be a big deal. It's far too many. We need to put a stop to it. But when we start saying that it's millions of children, essentially for political gain, boy, what is that? What does that tell us about our fellow citizens? Are we all cynics now? Are we all just, salesmen and spinmeisters who are willing to say anything to advance a political cause? Are we all propagandists? Do we believe anything that we say? Is there any room for sincerity in politics? I don't know. But I do know that people like this guy on the right in the green and white stripes, who's going to jail because he killed somebody that he thought, or was trying to kill somebody whom he thought was part of a cabal of, bad people. These people are victims. He's crazy. He doesn't know what he's doing. Maybe he does to some degree. And, maybe this is all baloney, but it sure seems to me like he is a crazy person who got radicalized and psyched up by a bunch of lies on the internet. And then he acted out his fantasies of being a pro-Trump secret agent. We can hope that this doesn't get worse, but it's hard for me to imagine that it won't. And this is just so cynical. Anytime you encourage, anytime you spread slander about somebody, accuse somebody of attacking children, especially, which is what a lot of these conspiracy theories revolve around, it seems to me that that's encouraging violence. Maybe not directly, and maybe not in a way that we can hold them accountable. But the people who put together this conspiracy theory, who it's pretty clear that they did so cynically, and knowing that it was a lie, they didn't have one of the QAnon people, the people who claim to have a Q security clearance, turned out to be a kid living in Chandler with his parents, was recently arrested for, and I say recently, in the past few months, was arrested for threatening the Queen of Denmark. These people themselves have some mental issues, I would say, but still, they know enough to know that they're lying, I think. And, when do we hold them accountable? People are freaking out that QAnon stuff is being taken off of Facebook and Twitter. They're purging and censoring their content. But if you're making, if you're spreading these kinds of falsehoods, either directly or in coded language, boy, when does Facebook have the right to act? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I wasn't really that aware of specifically of this issue. I mean, I've heard of Pizzagate, and I've heard of Q, and I've seen a lot of the accusations. And I'll be honest, for the most part, I think these people are harmless, and I think they're just a little bit delusional. I have a neighbor who believes this kind of stuff, who is into the 5G conspiracy. Anytime I'll talk to him, which I do, he's a good guy. He's a very good guy.
Sure.
He's totally into it. And I think they're harmless. I'm much more concerned about the riots in Portland and the riots recently in Chicago and the agenda of these people than I am about this stuff. I think you're always going to have people that believe weird things in the absence of good information. And human trafficking and child exploitation is a great example of that. It's a great example of that. And people should be asking questions about that, because the fact of the matter is we don't know what the scope of the problem is. Nobody knows what the scope of the problem is. That's the nature of that kind of problem. It's underground, and it's something that is. I mean, there are churches that do this. I'm sorry. I mean, there's all sorts of issues out there that people don't understand. I get bombarded by ads about the Boy Scouts every night when I'm watching TV about the lawsuits there in terms of sexual exploitation. And the fact that they went bankrupt over this issue. I don't know if you're aware of that. Boy Scouts of America bankrupt over this issue of sexual exploitation to children. So it happens. It absolutely happens. I've talked to victims of it. You know what I mean? People that are adults and were victims of it and never talked about it until they were adults. Again, I've said this before, and I've said this to you even off the air too. It's like, I think what conspiracy happens, it's because first of all, there's a kernel of truth, and there's an absence of good information. And where there's an absence of good information, people will start to make things up. They will try to figure it out, just like we did as Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. We did the same thing, explain, why does the sun come up? Why does it come down? People try to explain these things with these mythological stories and things like that. It's human nature. If you don't have good information, you're going to start making things up. People have imaginations, and they're going to do it. But I don't see them as a real violent problem. I was even looking at this article a little bit about this gentleman here, and he actually did kill a mob guy. So I don't know, maybe good riddance, So but then I see what's happening. What happened down the street from where I live. When I see, what happened in Portland, when I see what just happened in Chicago, much more concerned about them and that agenda that's going on than I am about a lot of people that are just kind of a little bit deluded. This person's an extreme example of that, but I don't think he represents the majority of these people. I think the majority of these people are harmless. That's the bottom line. I just think the majority of these people are delusional and harmless.
Right.
So,
well, our majority of radical Muslims are harmless too. It doesn't take very many people, going off the rails. And if you have a mental health crisis, and especially like, as you said, there's a jump here where some of this stuff seems to be jumping into the mainstream. And over the past few months, we have seen this hitting the mainstream in ways that we haven't seen before. And the question is, I think you're right that most of these people the vast majority of these people are completely harmless. My question is why? if you really believed that the world was run by Satan worshiping lizard people who are, attacking children in unspeakable ways, that it reaches to the very highest levels of power, and that if the president loses in November, it's because of the deep state and all this stuff, and they're just trying, they need him to lose because otherwise he'll uncover all of this child molestation. Why aren't more of these people violent? Because what they seem to believe is pretty extreme. And it seems like this is not the kind of thing that if you really believed it, you would just sit around and do nothing.
Well, I think they think they are doing something. It's just a different mentality. You have people that, for them, the big thing that they're doing is a Facebook post. You know what I mean? That's just the mentality, especially today. That's the way people think now. A lot of people, and that's not that doesn't have anything to do with your political spectrum or anything anymore. Right. That's what people think. Oh, I said something on Twitter today really means something. I saw people, on Twitter endorsing the riots near my house, and they think that they're doing something by doing that because, they deserve it and all that kind of stuff. Because they're willing to say those kind of things behind a keyboard. It's a keyboard warrior mentality. They're willing to say all sorts of things, but they're not going to say that to your face. That's a completely different circumstance, and that's where you that's where you really cross the line. Obviously, is when you try to impose these kind of ideas on people. And for the most part, I don't see that happening. I don't see people trying to impose the idea on others, in any kind of violent sense.
You mean if QAnon were trying to proselytize people violently?
Yeah, or for that matter, just beating up people that don't agree with them. I don't see that. I don't see gangs of Q people going out there and beating up people, physically, because they disagree with them. I do see that happening with some of these riots, where people who disagree with them will go out to these things as a counter protest or just to say their own view, and they're assaulted or they're attacked. Or even people that are simply trying to get from point A to point B, they put roadblocks and they stop them and things like that. I've seen that. I've seen the footage of that kind of stuff happening, and it's allowed to happen. And that stuff to me is scary, because I'll tell you right now, if something like that happened to me, there's a very high likelihood of violence from both of us, because I am capable of defending myself if I have to. And so, it's not something that to me is something that I'm much more concerned about than this. I think a lot of these people are actually really well-meaning people. And I do think that there is a problem. I mean, I don't think there is. I know there's a problem. I know sexual exploitation exists.
Yeah.
I know, child exploitation. So it's a fact. I don't know the extent of it. And I wonder sometimes if it's, overblown, or if it's underestimated, or all those kind of things, like any thinking human being would, in the absence of good information. But I think that, a lot of these people, they're coming from a better place than I think the other side is. I guess that's the best way I can put it. If your biggest thing is that you're concerned about people being exploited, and people being, if that's your biggest thing, you're afraid of people being exploited. Well, that's not a bad thing to be afraid of. I'm afraid of that too. I don't like to see people being exploited, especially children. I don't like to see that. I think that's a bad thing. And we know there are rich and powerful people that do this kind of stuff all the time. It's come out. It's happened. We've had things with Me Too where we've seen things like that. These Me Too scandals, many of them involve minors. Many of those scandals involve minors. We've seen it. We know what happens. We could talk about Roman Polanski. I mean, this is not something new. This is stuff that's been going on for years.
Yeah,
so
he was celebrated for decades.
But again, that's sort of that kernel of truth, right? That you don't know exactly what the extent of it is, but you know that it's there. And if people are concerned about it, I think that's good. I mean, I think it's good they're concerned about it. If they start to act on it, like this guy, well, then you have a problem, right? If you start to act on those suspicions the way that you're talking about, because you're right. If you really, really believe that the problem is that bad, why aren't you doing stuff like this guy? Well, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer for how every single individual on the planet thinks. I think there's a lot of
Right.
people out there, and a lot of them have weird ways of thinking, and they have a lot of weird thoughts. And as long as they're not violent, they're entitled to those weird thoughts. My neighbor can
Sure.
go on talking about 5G and all how bad it is as long as he wants, until his face turns purple. He can do that
Yeah.
as much as he wants. If he starts going out and destroying 5G towers, well, then we got a problem.
Yeah, and I think your point about keyboard warriors, if you are, 20% sure this is true, you might share it online because you think, well, it's better that I share this than that I don't share it. And what if it turns out to be true and I didn't do anything? I didn't share this. So maybe that's what they're thinking. Maybe that's it. That they're not really believing this entirely, but they feel like, wow, there's so many accusations out there. I better be part of the discussion to show that they wouldn't say woke, but essentially that's it, right? That they're aware, they're red pilled, and so they know what's going on. Even if they don't believe each and every one of these details, even if they don't believe the majority of these details. But one kind of final question, but I think you made some really good points on that, by the way. But one kind of final question, if let's say that this is, 5, 10, 20% of the population gets sucked into believing things like this, and then they go to vote. What does that do to our democracy? If you have people making their decisions at the voting booth based on essentially what are hallucinations, what happens to our democracy when people are basing their vote in large part or primarily on the basis of things that are completely imaginary? And do you think that's possible? Maybe I'm overblowing this here, but it seems to me that if people really get sucked into their alternative reality, that the choices that we make at the ballot box are less, they're more random. You know what I mean? We're not discussing anything anymore. We're not voting on facts. We're not voting on people. We're voting on our own fantasies. And as you said, it's like mythology. It's this desire in us to make sense and tell stories about the world around us. And those stories may or may not make any sense whatsoever.
Well, I don't know if that's really a problem. I'll be honest with you, Pete, because there's a lot of atheists that would argue that if you're a person of faith, that you fall in that category. So I don't know exactly where the line is, because, it comes from your perspective. And, you think this is all bunk, which, I tend to agree with you. A lot of this Q stuff and all that kind of stuff is bunk. But the thing is, there's other people that think what we think is bunk. And so, it kind of becomes an endless circle. So again, I say, just like I said before, the best analogy I can put is like, my crazy neighbor. If he wants to say that 5G is terrible and he'll say that to anybody that'll listen, he's entitled to do that. The second he goes out and starts chopping a 5G tower down, well, then that's where the line is. And the line is very clear to me. I don't have a problem with him voting. He's a smart guy. He's an intelligent person. But
right. Let me frame this a little bit differently.
But he believes something crazy, in my opinion.
Yeah, let me frame this a little bit differently, because I'm not sure I'm really expressing this well. What would happen if 70% of Americans decided from now on we're always going to vote for the taller candidate, and in every race, if there's one candidate who's 5'10", another candidate who's 6'1", they're always going to vote for the 6'1" candidate because they think that the best leader is the tallest leader. What kind of would we be a democracy or republic in any meaningful sense if that's what was happening?
Well, considering most of our elections are a flip of the coin anyway, what's the difference?
Do you think democracy is a sham? Okay.
Well, in a two-party system, I mean, what's the difference? If it's yes or no anyway. Well, actually, that is a good example, because if I did just flip a coin on every election, is that really going to change anything? Is that really going to be catastrophic? You only have two choices anyway, Pete. So what does it matter? I don't know. All I can say is that, for me, that's one of the reasons that I think we need more choices, because it shouldn't always just be A or B. I'd like C,
Yeah.
D, Z. But that's where we're at. I mean, so I think there are people that do that, Pete, honestly. I think there are people that choose their candidates based on how they look. I don't think there's any denying that. In fact, there's statistics that I've heard about ever since women were given the right to vote, and where they've done studies on attractiveness and the fact that the more attractive candidate tends to win. There's a little bombshell there. That's a little grenade in the room. But I've heard that.
Right.
So I don't know if people necessarily make their decisions based on the kinds of things that we try to make our decisions, our political decisions based on. I think a lot of people, they're very ignorant of the issues. They're very ignorant of the candidates to begin with. So I don't know. I don't know if, if they were voting for the taller candidate, I'm not sure that really would have that much of an effect, other than short people stop running.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And so I know this is kind of a can of worms that we've just opened here. But it does call into question the legitimacy of our elections. And I don't know that there are any solutions. Maybe there are no solutions to this problem. Maybe it's not, as you said, maybe it's not a problem at all. But it does make me wonder when you talk to people about, like you say, they're basing it on the attractiveness of the candidates. They base it on the height of the candidates to some degree. Actually, that is a real thing. I didn't completely pick that out of nowhere. Or they pick it on the basis of who they think is part of a secret plan to overthrow the child trafficking cabal. I don't know what that says about our elections.
I know for a fact in my research that one of the reasons that Reagan was considered appealing was he was one of the first candidates actually ever, certainly one of the first elected presidents ever, that was not a member of a secret society. And that's a fact. That's an absolute fact. Ronald Reagan was never a member of a secret society. He actually campaigned on that to some extent. And that's one of the reasons people liked him. And by the way, there's a conspiracy right there, because a lot of people say the only reason that George Bush, his rival, was made his vice president was because he was a member of a secret society.
Yeah.
So
it's not a very good secret if everybody knows about it.
Well, I'm just saying, I mean, that's a fact. I mean, you go down to George Washington, he was a Mason, that so many presidents were Masons and things like that. So again, in the absence of good information, what can you do? You don't really know the answer. I think the main thing is, I think one of the good things is that you try to challenge these ideas. If you think that they're wrong, you try to challenge the idea the best that you can. And if people don't want to be rational, you just kind of got to move on, because if they're not going to listen, when you'll take the time to listen to them, but they won't listen to you, well, you're at an impasse at that point.
Yep. Well, this has been a very long episode of Liberty Starship, and I feel like we could talk for a very long time. Maybe we need to do a little more research on all this stuff, because, boy, I don't even know where to go from here. We can't trust our elections. We can't trust our elected officials. We can't trust Facebook. If you can't trust Facebook, I don't know who you trust. So, well,
if you're trusting Facebook, then I think you have an issue with what trust actually is, or
that could be. Well, trust no one, America. So until next week, I've been Peter Maines. I'm here with my co-host Eric Alexander, and until next week, you keep flying free.